Funny how getting fired for not being a team player was the only reason I didn't speak up sooner. If I had, the merger would have collapsed on the spot. My name is Elise Marlowe. I'm 41. And 5 weeks ago, I walked into the Monday morning leadership sink expecting another round of last-minute chaos control. That's what they always called it, chaos control, when I was the one cleaning up everything from budget overages to vendor meltdowns. I didn't mind. I was good at it. But that day, no one looked me in the eye. Mark Densley, the CEO, didn't even wait for me to sit down. "Elise," he said, voice smooth like he practiced it in front of a mirror. "We've appreciated your contributions, but we need alignment heading into the next phase. You've made it clear you're not aligned with our vision. Effective today, your role is being dissolved." No warning. No HR rep, just that line, "not aligned," followed by a folder someone had left near the coffee carafe like it was a leftover agenda printout. Inside, my termination letter. Backdated. Pre-signed. I didn't say a word. I didn't cry. I just looked at the fake ficus in the corner of the conference room and let my silence stretch long enough to make them uncomfortable. They wanted me gone because I asked too many questions. About the merger. About missing audit trails. About a quiet reallocation of phantom shares last quarter. And I think, maybe in that moment, Mark thought he'd won. He thought I'd walk out the door quietly and never look back. But what he didn't know. I wasn't just another mid-level VP. I was a silent co-owner of the firm he thought he controlled. Technically, I owned 48.7%. Through a trust structure. Finalized 3 years ago. Triggered by a clause he never read in a contract he never drafted, because I had. And in that room, as he smiled and dismissed me with a phrase I'd heard him use on junior staff dozens of times, "not a team player," I realized something. He didn't know. He really, truly didn't know. That was going to be a problem. For him. Stick around, because next, I'll tell you why this firing wasn't just personal, it was strategic. And why letting them think they'd erased me was exactly what I needed. They fired me the morning before the merger was set to close. $80 million in assets. 4 months of negotiations. And one final board vote scheduled for 9 a.m. the next day. That's why it mattered. They didn't just cut me loose, they cut me out. At the last possible moment. Before the ink dried. Before anyone had to acknowledge whose strategy had made the deal viable in the first place. For 3 months, I had been the one structuring the carve-outs. Forecasting debt liabilities. Cleaning up the balance sheets they'd neglected for 2 fiscal years. I was the reason the auditors signed off. I was the reason the private equity group even showed up at the table. But Mark didn't want that version of the story in the closing press release. He wanted a win with his name on it. Not a footnote that read, "based on financial frameworks created by Elise Marlowe." So, he erased me. The timing was precise, too precise to be anything but calculated. Fire me 24 hours before final sign-off, claim internal restructuring, and quietly scrub my name from the equity memo. They'd already printed a new org chart without my title. I saw it in the printer tray a week before the firing. I didn't say anything then either. I wanted to see how far they'd go. And they went all the way. I walked out that day without packing a single box. Just my coat, my phone, and a slim folder I kept in the lining of my tote bag. Inside it, notarized copies of the silent ownership trust, time-stamped escrow confirmations, and a power of attorney agreement that had never been revoked. All still valid. All still binding. They had no idea. Because they'd never asked who the trust named Emmy Langston belonged to. Langston was my mother's maiden name. I'd used it deliberately, years ago, when I quietly acquired the shares they assumed were held by dormant investors. All legal. All clean. And all invisible to men who only ever paid attention when someone shouted. I never shouted. I wrote the clauses. I signed the dotted lines. I tied the knots they never saw coming. Let me take you back 3 years. Because to understand how I got here, how I came to co-own the company that just fired me, you need to see what I saw then. You need to know what they overlooked. And why I started building something they couldn't delete. 3 years before they fired me, I sat alone in a notary office on West 46th with a cup of vending machine coffee and a pen that didn't work the first time I clicked it. I remember that detail. The pen. The way it stuttered before the ink caught. That's when I signed the transfer forms. Mark had just pushed through a voluntary buyback program for early investors, offering to reclaim legacy shares for a fraction of their current value. It was pitched as a goodwill gesture. Simplify the cap table, he said in a company-wide memo. Make room for new strategic partners. But I read the clause buried 4 pages deep. The shares weren't being retired. They were being reclassified. And there was nothing in the paperwork that said who they'd go to. That's when I started making calls. One of the original investors was a retired engineer named Albert Keene. We'd spoken once at a holiday mixer, he remembered my name. Said I was one of the few people who actually listened when he spoke. I asked if he'd be willing to transfer his Class C shares, quietly, through a holding structure I'd already set up. In return, I offered him full payout plus a portion of future advisory fees through a dummy entity. He agreed the next morning. That was share block 1. Over the next 18 months, I did the same with 4 other dormant shareholders. Always discreet. Always through the Langston Trust. Always structured with just enough legal insulation to keep my name off any registry the exec team might casually review. By the time I was done, I controlled 48.7% of the company. Not directly. Not loudly. But absolutely. They never saw it because they never looked. I was the quiet ops lead, the background strategist, the one who didn't mind letting others take the stage, as long as I got to build it. That was my edge. People assume power comes from visibility. But I'd learned early, visibility gets you targeted. Ownership gets you options. I didn't buy in because I expected betrayal. I bought in because I'd seen what happened to the last woman who questioned Mark's projections in a budget review. She was transitioned out 3 weeks later and replaced by someone with the word compliant in his reference letter. So I stopped asking questions. I started preparing. The Langston Trust was my way of saying, if the day ever came when they forgot who built this place, I wouldn't need to remind them. I'd just take the keys. And that day came faster than I thought. Because the merger Mark was so eager to close? It had one clause he'd overlooked. A clause I wrote. And when it triggered, he wouldn't be the one calling the shots. Stick around, because in part 4, I'll show you exactly how I built leverage while staying invisible. And why being underestimated was the most dangerous thing they ever did. I was never the loudest in the room. Didn't need to be. Let Mark charm the board with phrases he barely understood. Let the VPs posture over metrics they didn't calculate. I preferred the numbers. They didn't lie. And when they did, I knew where they hid it. I joined Graybridge Holdings 11 years ago, Director of Strategic Operations. No welcome post on LinkedIn. No corporate portrait with crossed arms and a staged bookshelf. Just a short sentence in the org chart and a keycard that gave me access to places most didn't know existed. I wasn't there to be seen. I was there to make things work. Every acquisition framework? I built it. Every restructure proposal? I wrote it. Every late-night call with legal when a client threatened breach? That was me, quietly rerouting disaster behind a muted Zoom avatar. Mark used to appreciate that. He'd forward me emails from panicked partners with a single line, "Clean this up." And I would. I stayed late. I skipped dinners. I made him look competent in every quarterly report. But somewhere along the way, he stopped seeing the value in what didn't make noise. The shift started 2 years ago. I began getting left out of meetings I used to lead. Forecast models I authored were passed around without my name attached. One time, I sat through a strategy session where they quoted my exact phrasing from a confidential memo, without realizing I was in the room. I didn't flinch. I didn't correct anyone. I took notes. Because silence is a mirror. It reflects what people really think when they believe you're not a threat. And in that silence, I saw everything, the blind spots, the fraud, the arrogance. So I leaned in. Not to fight them, yet. But to learn how deep the rot had spread. I started auditing quietly. Not with access they gave me, but with the side door privileges they forgot I had, legacy admin accounts from the Mellery acquisition that never got revoked. I traced payment trails, flagged inconsistencies, watched vendor contracts being inflated and backdated. They thought I was sulking. I was documenting. They thought I was fading. I was sharpening. Because I knew the merger would expose it all, if someone had the right leverage. And I did. But to use it, I needed to let the system finish the betrayal. So when they fired me, I didn't resist. I needed them to think I was gone. I needed them to sign everything without knowing who'd be reading the final draft. And they did. What they didn't know. The clause I'd slipped into the deal terms, clause 9.6b, would change everything the moment my name disappeared from the employee registry. Let me show you what clause 9.6b really says. And how one buried sentence made me the most powerful person in the entire merger. That's next. The merger was Mark's golden ticket. $80 million in projected synergies. 2 consulting firms, 1 press rollout, and a closing ceremony already tentatively scheduled at the rooftop ballroom of the Langford Hotel. Everything polished. Everything postured. But no one, read the footnotes. I had helped draft the preliminary integration terms before they brought in outside counsel. That was my role. Structure the skeleton before the lawyers filled in the meat. Clause 9.6b was buried on page 47 of the Internal Continuity Agreement. Sandwiched between indemnification language and board transition timelines. A clause no one noticed because it looked like boilerplate. But it wasn't. It stated, in the event that any listed originator of pre-merger financial architecture is terminated without due process, and without documented performance violation, all related projections shall be subject to mandatory audit and suspension pending reassessment. In plain English? If I was fired improperly, the deal froze. Instantly. Because I was the originator. Because the projections were mine. And Mark? He never asked how many of the numbers in the integration plan were built by me. He just assumed I'd quietly keep doing the math while he polished the narrative. He underestimated me. And more dangerously, he underestimated the clause. The firm we were merging with, Pendrix Capital, was meticulous. I'd worked with them before. They didn't like noise. They liked documentation. And clause 9.6b gave them legal grounds to halt everything if they smelled internal instability. All I had to do was let him trigger it. So I said nothing. When I saw him maneuvering around me in meetings. When he started calling my junior staff directly. When the CFO started asking questions I was supposed to answer. I stayed quiet. Because I needed him to do it. I needed him to fire me. Not out of anger. Out of strategy. Because only then could clause 9.6b activate. Only then would the board have to reopen the books. And only then would Mark realize the house he built was standing on numbers I controlled. But even that wasn't the real checkmate. Because clause 9.6b was just the first lock. There were others. And one of them, tied directly to ownership. To me. Next, I'll show you how I didn't just let them fire me. I orchestrated it. And why the walkout they thought ended my story was actually just the first move. They thought I'd fight. That I'd demand a meeting. Challenge the decision. Drag in HR, maybe even threaten legal action like others before me had done. But I didn't. I just nodded once, picked up the thin envelope they'd placed by the coffee station, and walked out. No drama. No questions. No last words. The elevator ride down from the 32nd floor felt slower than usual. Not because of the mechanics, but because for the first time in 11 years, I was leaving that building knowing I wasn't coming back as staff. I didn't take my plaque. I didn't touch the framed certificate on the shelf. I left the notebooks, the chargers, even the coat I kept on the back of my door. All I carried was my phone. And a single black drive no one had ever seen. On it, every version of the merger model. Every footnote. Every clause I'd embedded, including 9.6b. Each file encrypted. Timestamped. Watermarked with my digital signature, tied to a system they'd forgotten I'd built. When I reached the street, the sky had just started to break open. It was that color of morning that looks more like evening, steel gray, uncertain. I stood there for a second, letting the wind press against my coat, and let the silence settle. They thought I was gone. They thought they'd erased me. What they didn't know was that with one termination letter, they'd validated clause 9.6b. And per its terms, I now had the right to trigger a formal audit, halt the merger, and force a public review of every financial instrument I had touched. And they had no clue. Because no one asked who authored the framework. No one questioned why my name was listed in the originator metadata embedded in the financial sim. No one thought to check the signature logs. Mark had counted on my silence meaning surrender. But I wasn't surrendering. I was sequencing. Everything I'd built was designed to activate the moment they pushed me out. And the final step? That would come the next morning, at 9 a.m., when the board met to finalize the merger vote, using documents they believed were clean. They had no idea a clause was live. That a new name would appear on the audit notification. Mine. Because while they were busy cutting me loose, I was already logged into the server they thought I couldn't access. Let me show you what happened at 9:01 a.m., when clause 9.6b hit the boardroom. And the vote froze. At exactly 9:01 a.m., the internal system flagged an anomaly. It was subtle. Just a metadata trigger, nothing loud, nothing blinking. But it was enough. Clause 9.6b had activated. The moment the board opened the final merger deck, sent from Mark's assistant at 8:54 a.m., a verification bot ran the attribution scan. And saw my name missing. That was the condition. According to the language I wrote, the clause only activated if the principal architect of financial integration was no longer listed as an employee without due process review. They hadn't held one. They hadn't documented any violations. They just removed my access. And now, the clause didn't just freeze the vote. It forced the audit. At 9:04 a.m., I received the automated escalation ping on my private relay account, one that was legally tied to the Langston Trust's ownership oversight protocol. A failsafe I built into the system myself, years ago, when no one was watching. I opened my encrypted drive. Everything I needed was there. The original framework files, showing my authorship. The clause language, signed off in a side memo Mark never read. The trustee records linking the Langston entity to the strategic oversight role. And then came the most important piece. The proxy letter. It was dated 18 months earlier and authorized me, through the Langston Trust, to initiate a vote of no confidence in any executive found to have misrepresented board-aligned structures in the context of merger execution. Mark had signed that clause himself. Buried in the equity restructure package he rushed through during a funding crisis. He needed my help then. I gave it. But I also gave myself protection. Not out of malice. Out of pattern recognition. I'd seen what happened to people like me, quiet builders, women in shadows. We get erased. Piece by piece. Credit reattributed. Power redistributed. Unless we prepare, and I had prepared. The paper trail wasn't loud. It didn't scream. It was clean, exact, and legally binding. By 9:23 a.m., the Pendrix legal team sent a request for clarification to the board. At 9:31, the board paused the vote. And at 9:45, Mark walked into a room that was no longer under his control. But that's just the beginning. Because next, I'll show you how I didn't stop the vote to destroy the deal. I stopped it to renegotiate it. On my terms. The call lasted 7 minutes. Just long enough for Marcus Weller, my attorney in Boston, to skim the updated file stack and exhale a slow, satisfied breath. You wrote this like you knew this exact scenario was coming, he said. I did, I replied. He didn't ask why. He knew better than most that in corporate architecture, what looks like paranoia is often just experience with a longer memory. I'd met Marcus during an ethics arbitration case 5 years ago. A junior analyst had been scapegoated for a botched acquisition. I proved her innocence through metadata trails and payment timings. Marcus had been impressed. You ever need someone to build firewalls in court, call me, he said back then. So I did. That morning, I forwarded him everything. The clause. The audit trigger. The trustee records. The termination letter. And the signature Mark had forgotten he ever gave me. Marcus's voice didn't shift. He wasn't the emotional type. But I heard it in the pause. This is airtight. I know. Do you want to file a formal ownership assertion? Not yet. He waited. I want them to speak first, I said. On record. Publicly. Let them lie. Then we move. He understood. Sometimes power isn't in action. It's in the threat of it. In knowing you can flip the table, but choosing when. After we ended the call, I opened the firm's internal shareholder platform using the trustee override credential. Mark didn't even know such a credential existed. He'd spent so much time looking upward, toward board votes and press interviews, that he'd stopped looking sideways. Never asked where the legacy shares had gone. Never traced the shell entity quietly buying influence. At 10:07 a.m., I entered a temporary freeze request on all merger-related equity movements. Per trustee protocol, the system required one thing, an originator signature. I typed my name. Elise Langston Marlowe. The name he never saw coming. The freeze went into effect at 10:11. By then, Mark had already called an emergency meeting. And for the first time in years, I was the one they couldn't exclude. Next, I'll take you into that room. Where silence held more power than shouting. And the person they fired, walked back in as the deciding voice. They didn't expect me to show up. Certainly not to walk into the 11th floor boardroom carrying nothing but a leather folder and a flash drive. Mark's face went still the moment he saw me. He opened his mouth, to protest, to posture, but the general counsel raised a hand before he could speak. She holds proxy rights, the GC said quietly. And her request is valid under the pre-merger trustee clause. She has the floor. So I sat down. No one offered coffee. No one smiled. That was fine. I didn't come for hospitality. I came for the record. I plugged in the drive. The screen lit up. And I began to speak, not loudly, not emotionally. Just clearly. This is the original financial architecture of the Graybridge Pendrix deal. Version 3.1, authored by me. Here is the timestamp. Here is the clause, 9.6b. You'll notice the language surrounding termination triggers. You'll also notice Mark's initials approving this version via DocuSign, dated February 7th. I clicked again. This folder contains the projected debt rollover structure. Note the originator field. Click, and here, attached, is the memo Mark submitted to Pendrix last week. Same structure. Slightly altered inputs. No author attribution. I paused. Then I opened the last file. This is a recording. Captured via internal compliance software. It's from the closed-door prep session the night before my termination. You'll hear Mark say the words, quote, "Once she's out, we finalize without revision. She doesn't have standing anymore." The audio played. Crystal clear. Silence followed. One board member looked at his hands. Another glanced toward the door. Mark just stared at the screen, jaw tight, fingers steepled like he could somehow contain what had already unraveled. I closed the file. "I'm not here to stop the merger," I said calmly. "But the foundation has been compromised. And by policy, by his signature, the vote is invalid until reassessed." No one spoke. They didn't need to. The facts sat on the table, weighty and final. This wasn't revenge. This was correction. Next up, the emergency vote. And the moment I called it, not as an employee, but as an owner. They didn't call it a board meeting. Officially, it was labeled Executive Contingency Session. Unofficially, it was a scramble. 4 board members, 1 general counsel, 2 legal observers from Pendrick's Capital, and Mark, sitting at the head of the table like the title still meant something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The documents had already spoken. I walked in, took my seat, not at the edge like before, but directly across from him, and laid down a single-page motion. Per Shareholder Clause 4.2, in the event of executive misrepresentation during a live transaction, any proxy holder with controlling interest may call for an emergency vote. Mark scoffed. "You don't have controlling interest." "Langston Trust does," I said, "and I hold its proxy." The GC looked up, scanned the motion, and nodded once. "She calls the vote now." The words dropped like stone. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the ceiling vent. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. That would have made it personal. But it wasn't. This was structure. This was order. This was what happens when people mistake silence for absence. Mark tried to object, mumbled something about precedent, optics, shareholder confidence. But the Pendrick's observers were already taking notes. They weren't here for pride. They were here for legal alignment. And I had it. "All in favor of motion to suspend merger finalization pending reassessment of executive conduct and source architecture?" I asked. Hands went up. 4. Plus mine. Majority. Mark stayed down. Didn't matter. The motion passed. The deal froze. And for the first time in a decade, Mark Dentsley wasn't in control. I was. But I didn't fire him. Not yet. Because next, I wanted him to choose his own ending. So I gave him 3 doors. And told him to pick one, before I did it for him. I didn't fire Mark that day. Not because I couldn't. Because I wanted him to feel the silence. The kind that hangs in a boardroom after your authority evaporates. The kind that echoes louder than shouting. The kind you can't talk over because it doesn't talk back. After the vote, I stayed behind as the others left. One by one, avoiding eye contact, murmuring things like "we'll reconvene" or "next steps to be determined." Only Mark and I remained. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The panic was already sitting in his throat. I placed a second folder on the table, this one thinner, more precise. 3 options, I said, evenly. All legal. All final. He opened it slowly. Option 1, immediate resignation with non-disclosure, full benefits terminated, severance waived. Option 2, demotion to advisory role, non-voting, 18-month review cap, public acknowledgement of misrepresentation. Option 3, formal audit and ethics violation filing with the SEC, full disclosure to Pendrick's, litigation expected. I watched his eyes flicker as he read. "I thought you wanted to destroy me," he muttered. I tilted my head. "If I wanted that, I would have let you sign the merger." He swallowed hard. "I can fight this," he said, quieter now. "You already did," I replied. "This is what losing looks like." He didn't choose that day. I didn't ask him to. I just stood, picked up my folder, and walked to the door. "Decide before noon tomorrow," I said, without turning around. "After that, the decision won't be yours." And I meant it. Because I wasn't just taking back the room. I was rewriting who owned it. And in part 12, I'll show you what happens when the one they fired becomes the one setting the vision. He chose option 1. Didn't fight. Didn't argue. Just left a signed resignation on the GC's desk at 8:12 a.m. the next morning. No statement. No press release. No staged farewell. The board asked if I wanted to issue a transition memo. I said no. Let the silence explain it. That afternoon, I moved into the office that used to be his. It was exactly as I expected, pretentious, overdecorated, all glass and ego. I had the framed golf photos taken down, the liquor cart removed. Kept the desk. It was functional. By 2 p.m., I was chairing my first executive realignment meeting. Not as VP. Not as proxy. But as acting managing partner of Graybridge Holdings. Some stared. Some nodded. A few tried to pretend nothing had changed. I let them. Because I wasn't here for applause. I was here to rebuild. The merger? It's back on track, but this time, with new conditions, new numbers, and my name listed under lead architect. No buried clauses, no overwritten credits. Just clean strategy, audited oversight, and ownership where it belongs. People have asked if I ever regretted staying silent that long. If I wished I'd spoken up sooner. But here's the thing. Revenge isn't noise. It's clarity. And the day they fired me? They didn't end my story. They just handed me the pen.